The dust had not yet settled on her husband's grave when Annie Crawford decided she would drive that wagon west herself, with nothing but 2 mules, a rifle she barely knew how to fire, and a stubbornness that had always been her greatest virtue and her most considerable flaw. It was the spring of 1874, and the Kansas plains were still wearing their winter pale faces, the grasses just beginning to blush green along the edges of the trail that stretched out before her like a promise nobody had bothered to sign. Annie was 26 years old, a widow of exactly 11 days, and she had already cried herself dry. There were no more tears left in her, only the dry, determined ache of a woman who had made up her mind and would not unmake it for anything or anyone. Her husband, Robert Crawford, had been a decent man. Not a great man, not the kind of man who filled a room or filled a heart to overflowing, but decent in the way that solid, useful things are decent. He had worked hard and died harder, taken by a fever that swept through Abilene in late February with a cruelty that made no distinctions between the good and the wicked. She had nursed him for 10 days and lost him on the 11th, and by the 12th she had begun making decisions. The land they had spoken of, the stretch of Kansas territory west toward the Colorado border, the land Robert had described to her on winter evenings when the wind shook the walls of their rented room in Abilene, that land was still out there. It had not stopped existing simply because Robert had. And Annie Crawford, who had come west from Ohio with dreams she had partially surrendered and partially preserved, had decided that the land still belonged to their plan, even if only half of the plan's architects remained alive to execute it. She had packed carefully and practically. Flour, salt, cornmeal, dried beans, coffee, a smoked side of pork wrapped in cloth, blankets, Robert's tools, her sewing basket, 2 good knives, the rifle, and a box of ammunition that Mr. Harlan at the general store had sold her with an expression suggesting he doubted she would manage to load it. She had loaded it twice in the alley behind the store just to prove something to herself, and then she had climbed up onto that wagon bench and pointed the mules west. That had been 3 days ago. The first day had passed without incident, the flat Kansas landscape unrolling ahead of her like a bolt of brown and gold cloth, the sky enormous and indifferent above. She had camped alone that night beside a creek with cottonwoods leaning over it, and she had lain in the wagon and listened to the coyotes and been only moderately frightened. The second day had brought wind and the distant shapes of a cattle herd moving north, and she had watched the riders pushing the herd and felt the particular loneliness of a person who is surrounded by activity that has nothing to do with her. It was on the morning of the 3rd day, when the trail had grown rougher, and the landmarks she had memorized from Robert's descriptions had begun to seem unreliable, that she noticed the rider. He appeared from the southwest, coming up across a shallow rise at an easy lope, his horse a deep bay that moved with the economical grace of an animal well cared for and well trained. The man on its back was lean and long in the leg, wearing a faded canvas duster the color of dried grass, and he rode with that particular posture of men who had spent so many years on horseback that the distinction between sitting and riding had ceased to exist for them. His hat was brown, pulled low against the morning glare, and he carried his rifle in a saddle scabbard with the butt angled back toward his hip. Annie watched him approach with the careful attention of a woman alone on an empty trail, her right hand moving to rest on the bench beside her where the rifle lay. She had not loaded it this morning. She considered that an oversight now. But the rider did not approach her directly. He came up alongside the trail about 30 yards to her left, matching the pace of her mules with a naturalness that suggested he had not made a decision to do so, that it had simply happened the way breathing happens. He tipped his hat brim in her direction, a brief, economical gesture, and then fixed his gaze on the horizon ahead and rode. He did not speak to her. He did not come closer. He simply rode. Annie watched him from the corner of her eye for a long quarter of an hour, waiting for something, for the approach, for the proposition, For whatever it was that men alone on empty trails eventually wanted from women alone on empty trails. But nothing came. He rode at 30 yards, his horse moving in easy rhythm beside her lurching wagon, and the morning stretched on around them both. After a while she stopped watching him quite so carefully, because the watching was more exhausting than the driving, and she needed to watch the trail anyway. But her awareness of him did not diminish. It sat at the edge of her attention like a sound just below the threshold of identification, present and insistent without being named. By midday he had neither approached nor retreated. When she stopped to water the mules at a creek crossing, he watered his horse downstream without being asked, and without asking anything in return. When she ate her cold biscuits on the wagon bench, he ate something from his saddlebag on horseback, facing away from her with a consideration that felt deliberate. She found herself, to her considerable irritation, wanting to know his name. The afternoon passed, the shadows lengthened. Annie found the camp spot she had roughly planned for, a hollow with good grass and a spring fed by some underground source that kept a small pool clear and cold even in the driest seasons, or so Robert's notes had indicated. She brought the mules in, unhitched them, and had begun leading them to the water when she realized the rider had stopped at the edge of the hollow and was making no move to come further. She stopped. She looked at him. "You can water your horse," she said, because she was not unkind and she was not foolish, and a man who had ridden beside her all day without once making her feel unsafe had earned at least that much. He nodded once, brought the bay down to the spring, and let the horse drink. Then he backed off to the far side of the hollow, perhaps 50 yards from where she was setting her small camp, and began making his own. A fire, a bedroll, the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this so many thousands of times it required no thought. He still had not spoken to her beyond that initial tip of the hat. Annie cooked her beans over her fire and listened to the night birds and tried very hard not to be curious about the silent rider. She was unsuccessful. Curiosity had always been another of her defining characteristics, and it did not discriminate between appropriate and inappropriate objects. She was just considering whether to say something across the 50 yards of darkening grass when she heard him speak for the first time. "Mountain Lion's been following your wagon since about noon," he said. His voice was even and low, the kind of voice that did not perform itself, that simply existed without ornament. "It's upwind of you now, just past that ridge line. Probably just curious, but I'll keep the fire going tonight." Annie turned to look at the ridge he had indicated, and she could not see anything, but the fact that she could not see it did not mean it was not there. She thought about the rifle, which was loaded now, because she had loaded it before making camp. "I appreciate the warning," she said, and that was all either of them said that first night. She slept better than she had slept since Robert died, which made no logical sense, and which she attributed to exhaustion rather than to the presence of a quiet fire burning 50 yards away on the other side of the hollow. The second day began the same way the first had ended, which was to say it began in a silence that felt less like the absence of words, and more like a particular kind of communication that had not yet found its shape. Annie hitched the mules, loaded her camp, and climbed up onto the wagon bench, and when she looked out across the flat morning land the rider was already there, sitting his horse at 30 yards, waiting in the easy patient way of horses and the men who understand them. She did not think about this too hard. She simply drove and he simply rode. But the second day was not without its events. Around mid-morning the trail crossed a series of washouts from spring flooding, shallow gullies cut across the rutted track that required the wagon to angle through them carefully or risk breaking a wheel. Annie managed the first 3 with more skill than she had expected of herself. The fourth defeated her. The right front wheel dropped into a hidden depression beneath the muddy floor of the gully and stuck there, and all of Annie's urging of the mules produced nothing but the sound of the wheel spinning and the wagon tilting at an angle that made everything inside shift alarmingly. She climbed down. She looked at the wheel. She was not certain she possessed the means to address the situation unassisted. The rider had stopped at the edge of the gully. He was looking at the wheel too. "I can get it free," he said, "if you want." "I want," Annie said, because pride was one thing and practicality was another, and she had always been clear on the difference. He dismounted in a single flowing motion and handed her his reins without ceremony, which she took, and then he waded into the gully mud in his good boots without any visible hesitation or complaint about the boots. He assessed the wheel with his hands before he assessed it with his eyes, running his fingers into the mud to find where the wood was caught, and then he braced himself in a way that used his whole body and his legs like levers and said, "Drive them forward when I lift." Annie drove them forward when he lifted. The wheel came free with a sucking protest from the mud, and the wagon lurched up onto solid ground, and Annie brought the mules to a stop and turned around on the bench to look at him. He was standing in the gully up to his knees in mud, his hands brown with it, and he was looking at the wheel with the satisfied expression of a man who has correctly predicted an outcome. "Thank you," Annie said. He nodded, waded out of the gully, retrieved his reins from her, and mounted his muddy-legged horse without another word. By the time she had the mules moving again, he was back at 30 yards, riding west. Annie spent the next hour thinking about him, which she considered a waste of attention but could not seem to prevent. In the early afternoon they crossed a stretch of open grassland where the wind came hard from the northwest, and Annie had to lean into it on the bench, her bonnet whipping at its ties, her hair escaping in pieces to lash across her face. She was occupied with managing the mules in the wind, which did not like it, when the rider came closer. Not close enough to crowd her, but close enough that she could see his face clearly for the first time without squinting against the distance and the light. He was perhaps 30 years old, maybe 31 or 32. His face was the kind of face the plains made, weathered and angular, with lines at the corners of his eyes that came from years of looking at too much horizontal light. His eyes were gray-green, she decided, though it was hard to be certain at this distance. His jaw was clean-shaved, which surprised her. He had the look of a man who attended to certain things carefully. He was not conventionally handsome. He was something better than that. He was the kind of face that a person did not notice all at once, but could not stop noticing once they had started. He said nothing about coming closer. He simply stayed there as the wind required it, near enough to help if the mules spooked without being near enough to seem like anything other than a reasonable precaution. When the wind settled again, he drifted back to his 30 yards. Annie thought with some exasperation that she had never met a man who was so thoroughly present without demanding anything for the presence. It was a new experience, and new experiences, she had learned, deserved careful attention. That evening's camp was at the base of a long limestone bluff that cut the wind and held the day's warmth after dark. There was a cluster of scrub cedar trees, and Annie made her camp among them while the rider made his own camp a considerate distance away at the bluff's edge. The fire he built was larger than the previous night's, and she suspected this was because the temperature was dropping more sharply, the Kansas spring still not fully committed to warmth. She had made enough beans and cornbread for two, though she could not have explained what impulse had guided her hands while she was cooking. She stared at the extra portion for a long moment, and then picked up the tin plate and walked across the grass toward the man's fire. He looked up when she was still some feet away, and he did not look surprised. He looked as though he had been expecting something but had made no plans about what that something would be. "I made too much," she said, which was true enough in its way. "Thank you," he said, and took the plate. She stood there for a moment, meaning to go back to her own fire, and instead found herself sitting down on the limestone outcrop a few feet from his bedroll, because her legs had apparently decided without consulting her. He ate without performing gratitude or conversation, which she found she appreciated after a lifetime of men who treated every interaction as an opportunity to narrate themselves. "What's your name?" she asked. He looked up from the plate. Matthew Keating, he said. Annie Crawford, she said. He nodded as though this confirmed something he had suspected. Where are you headed, Mr. Keating? She asked, because she was curious and she had decided that being curious did not require an apology. He looked at her for a moment with those gray-green eyes that had some quality she could not yet identify, some quality of seeing clearly without making the thing seen feel exposed or diminished. West, he said. It was not much of an answer, but it was an honest one. She could tell honest answers from dishonest ones. That had always been one of her skills. There's a lot of West, she said. There is, he agreed. She went back to her own fire, but she took the image of his face and the sound of his voice with her, and they kept her company in the dark in a way she had not expected and had not invited and was not at all certain what to do with. The next morning she woke before dawn, which was unusual for her since Robert's death because grief tends to make sleep a refuge. And she lay in the wagon and listened to the birds beginning, and the horses and mules moving at their picket lines, and the small creak of the planes coming awake. She was thinking about the question she intended to ask, the question she had been building toward since the previous evening, the question that had grown in her while she slept until it had become the first solid thing in her morning mind. She made coffee, because you do not ask important questions without coffee, and she thought about Robert, and she thought about the land waiting ahead of her, and she thought about a man who had ridden beside her for 2 days without asking for anything or explaining himself, and she thought about how those things connected or did not connect and what any of it meant. When Matthew Keating rode over to the edge of her camp, clearly ready to move, she was ready too. She had hitched the mules and loaded the wagon and was standing beside it with her coffee cup, and she looked up at him on his bay horse and felt the question rise up through her like something she had been holding underwater and could no longer hold. "Mr. Keating," she said, "you've ridden alongside me for 2 days now." "I have," he said. "Where are you headed?" she asked. He looked at her for a long moment, with the morning light coming sideways across his face and the plains behind him enormous and still, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was in the same neighborhood as a smile, something that had been waiting for exactly this question and had its answer already prepared. "Here," he said. Annie Crawford stood very still with her coffee cup and looked at him. "Here," she repeated. "Here," he said again, with a quiet certainty that made it the simplest and most complicated word she had ever heard. She stood there another moment and then she said, "Well, then, I suppose you had better tell me something about yourself, Mr. Keating, if you are planning to be here." He dismounted, tied his horse to the back of the wagon without being asked, and climbed up onto the bench beside her. And when she clicked the mules forward, he was sitting at her right hand, and the 30 yards of careful distance had collapsed into 3 feet of intentional closeness, and the whole character of the morning changed. Matthew Keating had been born in 1844 in a small farmstead outside of Lexington, Missouri, the second of 4 sons. He said this plainly, without the false modesty that some men used to seem humble or the false drama that others used to seem interesting. He simply said it the way you say a thing that is true. His father had been a good farmer and an impatient man, and Matthew had learned both farming and patience from him, the first by instruction and the second by necessity. He had 2 brothers still living, one in Missouri and one in California, and a brother buried in Virginia from a war that had taken a great many brothers. "The war," Annie said. "I was there," he said. "Union cavalry, 2 years of it." She looked at his profile, at the clean jaw and the level eyes, and thought about what 2 years of Union cavalry in the war had cost men she had known. She thought about the particular kind of quiet that men brought back with them from that conflict, the quiet that was not peace but was the thing that came after a person had used up all of their loudness in a place where loudness was required and lethal in equal measure. "I'm sorry," she said. "It was a long time ago," he said. 10 years now." After the war he had drifted into the cattle trade, working drives up from Texas to Kansas, learning the trails and the cattle, and the particular knowledge of open country that turned a man into something that belonged to it the way trees belong to the soil that holds them. He had worked for other men's brands for 7 years and saved enough money to think about his own. "What happened to the land you were thinking about?" Annie asked. He was quiet for a moment. "I hadn't found the right one yet," he said. She thought about that answer and decided she needed to think about it more before she knew what she thought about it. "My husband had land picked out," she said. "West of here, toward the Colorado line. Creek water, good grass, a shelf of limestone that would make decent building material." "What happened to your husband?" Matthew asked, and there was nothing prurient or pushy in the question, only the plain, straightforward curiosity of a person who is trying to understand the shape of another person's situation. "Fever," she said. "February." "I'm sorry," he said, and it did not sound like a social formula the way it often did. It sounded like he actually was. "He was a good man," Annie said. "Not a great one, but good. He would have liked this land." She gestured at the plains around them, the grass rippling in the morning breeze, the sky so blue and so enormous that it made you feel both small and significant at once, which was the particular genius of the Kansas sky. "It's good land," Matthew agreed. "Do you know anything about building?" she asked. "Enough," he said. "Cattle, more than enough." "Then I suppose," Annie said carefully, "that if you are determined to be here and I have nowhere to put you except alongside, you might as well be useful." "I generally try to be," he said. They drove in silence for a while, and it was a different silence than the previous 2 days' silences. It had more texture now, more interior life. It was the silence of two people who were beginning to understand that they might be having a conversation that would outlast the morning. Annie found herself thinking about what it meant to be in the company of a person who had no agenda that she could detect. Robert had always had an agenda, not a bad one, but a clear and continuous one, a forward motion toward defined goals, the farm, the livestock, the family, all of it planned and plotted with the thoroughness of a good surveyor. There had been comfort in that. There had also been a kind of confinement in it that she had not fully understood until she was outside of it. Matthew Keating seemed to have only the agenda of the present moment, which was to be useful to be here, and to ask nothing in excess of what the situation required. It was, she thought, a very restful way for a person to be. They stopped at midday in the shade of a creek's cottonwood border, and Matthew unhitched the mules and led them to water with an ease that told her he had done such things before in the practical way of a person to whom caring for animals was simply part of being in the world. Annie made lunch from cold biscuits and dried apricots she had packed from Abilene, and they sat on the creek bank and ate, and the creek talked to itself beside them in the good way that moving water always does. "You grew up in Ohio," he said. It was not a question. "How did you know that?" she asked. "The way you say certain words," he said, "and the way you hold a rifle," she laughed. She had not expected to laugh, and the sound surprised her, coming out of her chest with a warmth she had almost forgotten was in there. "How does an Ohio woman hold a rifle?" she asked. "Like she learned it from a book," he said, "and did a very good job with the book." She laughed again, and this time it felt easier, felt more like something that lived in her rather than something that was visiting. "I practiced in an alley in Abilene," she said, "behind the general store." "I could tell," he said, and there was nothing unkind in it, only a kind of gentle accuracy. "Could you teach me to do it better?" she asked. He looked at her for a moment with that look she was beginning to understand was his version of surprise, the version that did not show itself in the obvious ways, but in a slight opening of the gray-green eyes, a slight shift of attention from general to specific. "Yes," he said. He showed her that afternoon, when they stopped for the night at the camp spot Annie had identified from Robert's notes as the last before the land claim. He was patient and precise in the way that the best teachers are, which is to say he corrected without diminishing and explained without condescending. He moved her hands into the right positions with a care that was entirely practical and entirely respectful, and she found herself noting the quality of his hands, the roughness of work, and the gentleness of intention existing in the same pair of hands, which she thought was a meaningful combination in a person. She put 3 shots within a hand's width of each other on the smooth face of a cottonwood tree at 50 yards, and Matthew made a sound that might have been approval. "Again," he said. She put 3 more in the same cluster. "You don't learn from a book," he said. "You learn from doing." "Most things are like that," she said. He nodded, took the rifle, and checked the load with the practiced automatic attention of a man who does not leave such things to chance, and handed it back to her. "Keep it close tonight," he said. "We're at the edge of unsettled country now." "How unsettled?" she asked. "Not dangerous, not usually," he said, "but unpredictable. There have been bands moving through, people displaced by the treaties that didn't hold." Annie knew about the treaties that didn't hold. Everyone who had come west in these years knew, and most who had any honesty about them knew also that the failure of the treaties was not the fault of the people the treaties had displaced. The government had made promises and broken them with a consistency that had become something of a pattern, and the cost of that pattern was paid by the people who had lived on this land long before anyone from Ohio arrived with a wagon full of intentions. "I won't shoot first," she said. "No," he agreed. "Neither will I." She looked at him. "Some men out here would." "Some men out here are fools," he said. They cooked together that night without discussing who would do which part, naturally dividing the tasks in the way that people who have been in each other's company for some time do, except that they had only been in each other's company for 2 days and some hours, which made the naturalness of it seem like either very good luck or something else that Annie was not ready to name. After dinner, Matthew poured coffee into both cups, and they sat by the fire, and the night was enormous around them. The Kansas sky pulled tight with stars, the kind of sky that you only get in places where there are no walls or buildings between you and the universe. And Annie felt something shift in her chest, felt the particular ache of grief move over and make room for something else, something that was not yet identified but was warm and present and needed space to breathe. "Matthew," she said, and she noticed that she had dropped the mister without deciding to. "Annie," he said, and she noticed that he had noticed. "Why did you ride alongside me?" she asked. "All that time before you spoke. Why not just come and introduce yourself and offer to help?" He considered this. He was not a person who answered questions before he had thought about them, which was another thing she was beginning to understand about him. "Because you didn't need help," he said. "You were managing fine. And I didn't want to be the kind of man who assumes a woman alone needs a man to tell her what she needs." Annie looked at him across the fire. She felt something she had not expected to feel, a specific, clear, directed warmth that was entirely different from the general warmth of the fire. "But you stayed," she said. "I stayed," he said. "Why?" He looked into the fire for a moment. Then he looked at her. "Because you were managing fine," he said, "and I wanted to see how the story came out." "It hasn't come out yet," she said. "No," he said. "Not yet." The land Annie had been heading toward was another half-day's drive from that final camp, and when they came over the long, gradual rise and saw it spreading below them in the afternoon light, she felt her breath catch in a way she had not expected. Robert's descriptions had been accurate in the way of maps, precise and useful, but they had not captured the quality of the light on the creek's surface. The way the limestone shelf along the southern edge caught the afternoon gold and held it, the particular depth of the grass that had grown uncut and undisturbed, the stand of elm trees along the water that provided shade in a country that was sometimes miserly with it. It was beautiful. Not in the dramatic way of mountains or the theatrical way of painted deserts, but in the way of the quietly useful, the genuinely good, the kind of beauty that is inseparable from function. It was land you could live on and love in equal measure. Annie stopped the mules at the top of the rise and sat there, and the feeling was complicated. There was triumph and there was grief, and there was something that was neither, some feeling she did not have a name for, which was the feeling of arriving somewhere you have not yet decided if you belong. She was aware of Matthew sitting beside her on the bench, saying nothing, which was his particular gift, the saying of nothing at exactly the moment when nothing was what was needed. He would have loved it, she said finally. Yes, Matthew said. I expect he would have. She drove the mules down the rise and into the property that Roberts claimed papers, signed before his death and carried in Annie's satchel, designated as hers. She drove to the creek and let the mules drink and stood by the water and listened to the elms move overhead, and she thought about beginnings, which are always also endings of the thing that came before. Matthew had set up a camp by the time she had finished listening to the water, and he had done it with a care that told her he was thinking about more than one night. He had chosen a spot on a slight rise with good drainage and clear sight lines, and he had found the spring that fed the creek higher up and confirmed that it ran clean, and he had walked the limestone shelf and knocked on it in a testing way and nodded to himself. Good building stone, he said. I know, Annie said. Robert said so. Robert was right, Matthew said. She began the work of establishing a home with the particular ferocity of a person who is in grief and needs something to do with their hands. She set up the camp properly, dug a root cellar to start, began marking where the cabin would go using Robert's plans that she had kept folded in the satchel alongside the claim papers. She worked from first light to failing light, and Matthew worked beside her, taking direction without complaint and offering suggestions only when she asked for them, which was another thing she added to her growing inventory of his qualities. The first week was hard in the way that all first weeks are hard, the work of beginning always being the most unformed and therefore the most effortful. But things took shape. The camp became more organized, the cellar got dug, and on the 5th day 2 men rode in from the east. They came at a canter, 2 men in trail-worn clothes with the specific look of men who have been making decisions about other people's property. Annie saw them first and watched them come without moving, her rifle propped against the wheel of the wagon. Matthew appeared from around the side of the camp as they were pulling up, and he stood with the easy, balanced posture of a man who is not looking for trouble but is thoroughly prepared for it. Afternoon, said the first man, a heavy-set man with a red beard and a hat that had seen better decades. We're looking for the Crawford claim. Understand it was put in by a Robert Crawford, dead this winter. That's right, Annie said. I'm Annie Crawford, the claim transfers to me. The man looked at her, then at Matthew, then back at her with the particular look that certain men in this period used when they were calculating how much a woman's legal position might be made to bend. The thing is, he said, the claim's in a dead man's name, and some questions have been raised about whether a widow can hold a territorial land claim without a male co-holder. Those questions, Annie said, are not supported by the Homestead Act of 1862, which makes no such distinction. The man blinked. He had not expected her to quote legislation. I have the claim papers, Annie said, with the territory commissioner's seal on them, and I have a rifle. I'm comfortable with both. Matthew said nothing. He did not need to. He simply stood in the particular way that very calm and very capable men stand when they want you to understand that they are both of those things. The second man, who had not spoken, said something quiet to the first man, and the first man looked at Annie's claim papers, which she had pulled from her satchel and held out with the air of a woman who has been thinking about exactly this moment, and he looked at Matthew, and he looked at the rifle. All in order, he said, which was not what he had ridden up expecting to say, and both men left at a pace slightly faster than the one they had arrived at. When they were gone, Annie let out a breath she had been holding since they appeared on the horizon. Matthew looked at her. That almost smile was there again. Homestead Act of 1862, he said. Robert read it to me 3 times, she said. He was a very thorough man. You have a very good memory, Matthew said. I have, she agreed. It's useful. That evening, sitting by the fire with the creek talking in the darkness beyond them, something changed between them. Or perhaps it was more accurate to say that something that had been changing since the first morning on the trail finally reached a point where it could not be denied or deferred. It was the way the firelight moved across his face and she watched it, and the way he was watching her watching it, and the way neither of them pretended otherwise. Can I ask you something? She said. Yes, he said. When you said here, she said, what did you mean exactly? He looked at her steadily. What do you think I meant? He said. I think, Annie said carefully, that you meant something very specific, and I think it would be better if you said it plainly. All right, he said. I rode alongside you for 2 days, and in those 2 days I understood something I have spent a considerable amount of time looking for without knowing I was looking for it. I think this land is worth building on. I think you are worth knowing better. I think those two things are related, and I am not the kind of man who walks away from something when he understands its value. The fire crackled between them, and the creek talked, and the stars blazed overhead in the enormous Kansas night. I am a widow of 3 weeks, Annie said. I have grief still to do. I know that, he said. I'm not asking you to have done it yet. I am not a simple woman, she said. I know that too, he said. I wouldn't be here if you were. She looked at him for a long time. Then here is what I can offer Matthew Keating, she said. I can offer this land which I need help to build on. I can offer honesty, which I intend to practice regardless of whether it is comfortable. I can offer the company of a person who is trying very hard to become whatever she is meant to be next. That is all I can offer right now. That's enough, he said. That's considerably more than enough. She went to bed that night with something warm in her chest that was not fire warmth but the other kind, the kind that comes from being seen accurately by another person and not finding it diminishing. The summer that followed was the fullest summer of Annie's life. They built the cabin through June and July, working in the heat of the Kansas days with a shared physical vocabulary that grew more fluent as the weeks passed. Matthew was an excellent builder, not formally trained but deeply experienced in the logic of structures, and Annie was a quick learner with good spatial intuition. And together they raised walls and a roof and a chimney of that good limestone, and a floor of planked wood hauled from a mill in the nearest town, 40 miles east. They drove to that town, a small but growing settlement called Millhaven, 3 times over the summer for supplies, and each time the trip itself was a kind of pleasure. The two of them on the wagon bench, talking or not talking as the mood required, discovering each other in the gradual and genuine way that people discover each other when they are working toward a shared thing. Matthew told her about the cattle drive years, the winters in Texas and the long push north through Indian Territory, the particular beauty of the Llano Estacado at dawn, the camaraderie of drovers that was as close to brotherhood as anything he had found since the war. He told her about the war itself, in pieces and on his own schedule, and she listened without pressing or flinching, because she understood that certain things require to be told in their own time. Annie told him about Ohio, about the farm her father had kept that was beautiful and small and quietly suffocating, about the school she had attended in Columbus, where a woman teacher named Mrs. Hargrove had introduced her to books that made the world seem larger than the farm, about meeting Robert at a church social, about the decision to come west that had been partly Robert's and partly her own and partly the consequence of that teacher's books that had made her want to see the large world she had read about. She told him about the Ohio girl she had been and the Kansas woman she was becoming, and she noticed, as she was telling him, that the Kansas woman felt more like her actual self. On a Tuesday in late July, with the cabin's walls up and the roof beams in place and the end in sight, they had a disagreement. It was about the window placement, which seems like a small thing and was actually not. Annie wanted the main window to face east for the morning light. Matthew wanted it to face south, for the practical reason that south-facing windows provided more warmth in winter and better light across a longer portion of the day. He was not wrong. She was not wrong either. The morning light was real and the winter warmth was real, and the cabin could only be built one way. They argued about it with the kind of directness that she had come to understand was characteristic of both of them, and neither of them backed down immediately because they were both people who did not back down from things they believed in. It's my cabin, Annie said. It's your cabin, Matthew agreed. And if we put the window east, you'll be grateful for the morning light from March to September and cold the other months. I am aware of when winter occurs, she said. I didn't suggest you weren't, he said. They stood in the partial walls of the cabin and looked at each other with the specific frustration of two people who are both right and both know it. South, she said finally, with a smaller window on the east wall. His expression shifted and she could see him making the structural calculations. The east wall won't take a large window, he said, but a smaller one placed right would work. Placed right then, she said. South with a small east window, he agreed. She turned away to pick up her hammer, and she heard behind her the sound she had come to recognize as his almost laugh, the brief exhale through the nose that was as close to a laugh as he usually came in ordinary circumstances. "What?" she said, not turning around. "Nothing," he said. I'm just what?" "Exactly what I expected," he said, "which is remarkable because I didn't know what to expect." She turned around then, because that seemed like something worth turning around for, and he was looking at her with an expression she had not seen from him before, open and unguarded and specific, and she felt the warmth in her chest shift and deepen into something that she now understood she was going to have to name. She named it to herself, quietly and privately, while she was hammering a board into the east wall where the small window would go. She named it Love, which was terrifying and accurate in equal measure, and she kept the name to herself while she hammered and thought about what to do with it. The cabin was finished in the second week of August, and the night they slept in it for the first time, with the rain they had been waiting for arriving just as dark came down, drumming on the new roof and running down the good limestone walls, Annie felt a completeness she had not anticipated. She lay in the dark and listened to the rain, and to the sound of Matthew's breathing from his bedroll across the room, which she had offered him because the house was built and there was a floor and because she was practical, and she thought about completeness and what it required and what she was willing to give it. In the morning the rain had stopped and the land was washed clean and bright, and Annie made coffee and looked out the south window at the creek and the grass and the sky. Matthew was already outside, walking the property line with the specific purposeful walk of a man who is thinking about the future shape of things. She brought him coffee and stood beside him and looked at what he was looking at. "Cattle," she said. "You're thinking about where to put them." "Eventually," he said. "First a proper corral and a barn, but yes, the grass is excellent. You could run 100 head without overstressing it." "We would need a brand," she said. He turned to look at her. She kept her eyes on the grass. "We," she said again and let the words sit in the morning air. "Annie," he said. "I'm not finished," she said. "When I say we, I mean it as a practical term and as an honest one. I have thought about this considerably, and I have decided that what I feel is real and that I am not the kind of woman who lets real things go unacknowledged out of fear or convention. I am also not a fool about timing, but I want you to know what I feel so you have accurate information." He was very still beside her. "Tell me what you feel," he said. "I feel that you are a good man," she said, "and I feel that you are my good man. And I feel that this land is where we are both going to be, and that the word we is the right word for what we are building on it." The morning was enormous around them, the wet grass sparking with light, the creek running high after the rain, the sky coming blue and clean and vast. "Annie Crawford," Matthew said, and his voice had something in it she had not heard before, something that in another man she might have called trembling, and she looked at him and saw that it was not quite trembling but was the closest thing to it that a man like him could produce. "I have spent 10 years," he said, "riding across every kind of country there is, and I have not found a thing I would plant myself for. Not land, not work, not company. And then I came over a rise and saw you driving those mules, and I understood something I am not sure I can explain in language that does justice to it." "Try," she said. He looked at her. "That here is where I was going all along," he said. "Just here, this place and this person. I have been heading here for 10 years without knowing the address." Annie felt her eyes fill, which surprised her, because she had thought she was dry, had thought the fever had taken her tears along with her husband, but apparently grief and love do not share a water supply. "We're going to need a bigger barn than you were thinking," she said. which was not what she had planned to say but felt like the truest thing available to say, because it was a sentence that assumed a future. He made the sound that was his laugh, the real one, the one she had heard only a handful of times, and it was worth the wait every single time, full and genuine and warm in the morning air. "Much bigger," he said. Matthew Keating proposed to Annie Crawford on a Sunday in September, on the limestone shelf above the creek, where the afternoon light came gold and horizontal. He did it simply and without theater, going down on one knee in the way the tradition required but speaking in his own plain, direct way, without flourishes or promises he wasn't certain he could keep, only the promises he was absolutely certain of. He said he would be honest with her. He said he would work alongside her and not above her. He said he would learn from her, which she suspected was something most men of this era would not have thought to offer. He said he would be present, which was the most important word he used, because she knew from Robert's decency and Robert's distance that presence was its own category of commitment. She said yes with her whole self, not just the word but the weight of her, and when he put the ring he had bought in Millhaven on the third supply trip on her finger, a simple silver band that he had not apologized for or over-explained, she looked at it and felt that it was exactly right. They were married in October by the circuit preacher, who came through the territory on a schedule that was aspirational at best. A thin, cheerful man named Reverend Alcott, who had performed ceremonies in more improbable locations than this, and treated the creek bank with the same dignity he would have given a proper church. They had 2 witnesses, a neighboring homesteader named Frank Aldrich, who had come by in August to introduce himself, and had stayed for supper, and had been a reliable if occasional presence ever since, and his wife Clara, who had brought a cake to the wedding that was the finest cake Annie had eaten in years, and who had wept with the joyful efficiency of a woman who considers weddings a personal triumph for all of womanhood. The November that followed was cold, colder than Annie had prepared for, the Kansas winter arriving with the particular blunt force of a season that has no patience for gradual transitions. But the cabin was solid and the chimney drew well, and the root cellar was full, and they were warm in the way that you are warm when you have built the thing that contains you. They spent those long winter evenings reading to each other, because Annie had brought books and Matthew had been given books by his brother in Missouri, and sent books from the brother in California, and they found that their tastes overlapped in some areas and diverged entertainingly in others, and the discussions that came from the divergences were some of the best conversations Annie had ever had with anyone. He read to her in the evenings, and she sketched plans for spring, and the fire burned, and the snow moved past the windows, and they were building each other in the way that people build each other when they have decided to be honest and present and permanent. On a night in January, Matthew came inside from checking the animals in a weather that had turned sharp and bitter, and he shed his coat and sat down close to the fire, and Annie brought him coffee and sat beside him, and they were close together on the bench by the hearth, and she leaned against him in the way you lean against something you trust to hold your weight. He put his arm around her. The fire burned. The wind moved past outside and did not get in. "Matthew," she said. "Annie," he said. "I think we should plant the south field in spring," she said. "Corn and wheat, the soil's deep enough." "We'll need a plow," he said. "We'll buy one in Millhaven," she said. "In the spring," he agreed. She looked up at him. "You are the best decision I have made in my life," she said, "including the decision to drive west alone." He looked at her. "You drove west alone so I could find you," he said, with the very slight curve at the corner of his mouth that was the closest he usually came to showing all of what he felt. "That's extremely presumptuous," she said. "It worked out, though," he said. "It worked out," she agreed, and she meant it with everything she had. Spring came back to the Kansas plains with the extravagance it always brings after a hard winter, the grass coming up thick and green, the creek running high and musical, the sky changing from its winter iron to its summer blue by degrees that felt generous and deliberate. Annie and Matthew planted the south field, acquired 2 additional mules from Frank Aldrich who had more than he needed, and began the construction of the barn that they had been designing all winter on paper and in conversation. The cattle came in May. Matthew had ridden south to arrange it, 3 days away and 3 days back, and when he returned, he had 12 head of good Texas stock following him at the end of a rope, and Annie watched him ride in across the creek with the cattle strung behind him and felt something that was very specifically the feeling of watching the future arrive. Clara Aldrich came by in May also on a Tuesday afternoon and sat in Annie's kitchen and drank coffee and told Annie in the forthright way of a woman who trusts another woman that Annie looked different than she had in October. Different how? Annie asked. Settled, Clara said. Not the sad kind of settled, the good kind. The kind where you're growing rather than just holding still. Annie thought about that. I am growing, she said. Both of us are. Clara looked at her with the particular sharp attention of a woman who is putting information together. Both of you, she said. I'm expecting, Annie said, which was the first time she had said it to anyone other than Matthew, who had stood very still when she told him, and then had pulled her into his arms with a care that suggested she had become suddenly more breakable, which she had firmly corrected by pointing out that she was not a china cup. Clara made a sound that was several things at once, joy and affirmation and the particular knowing satisfaction of a woman who had already put the pieces together before she was told. When? Clara asked. December, Annie said. Franklin was born in January, Clara said. The hardest and the best month I ever lived through. I'm not afraid, Annie said. No, Clara agreed. You wouldn't be, but it helps to have someone who loves you beside you. Matthew received the news of the coming child with the quietness that was his way, but Annie had learned to read his quietness, and this one was full of something large and serious and deeply joyful that he was processing with the thoroughness he brought to everything important. He held her hands and looked at her and said, Are you all right? And she said, I am wonderfully all right, and he believed her because she was not a person who said things she didn't mean. He began, quietly and without announcement, to add things to the cabin. A second room attached to the back, built through the summer months in the time he could spare from the cattle and the crops, a room with better windows and a smooth floor and space enough for a crib and a child who would grow. He did not ask her what she wanted in it. He built it and then asked her what she wanted to change, which was his particular genius, the ability to create something and hold it loosely enough to let another person shape it. She changed the window placement, because of course she did. The summer of 1875 was good to the Crawford Keating claim, which had not been formally named, but which Annie sometimes thought of as the Here Ranch, for reasons that Matthew alone would have understood, the understanding being part of what made it funny and part of what made it true. The crops came in, the cattle grew fat on the grass, and Matthew built the barn and Frank Aldrich came to help with the raising of the main beam, and Clara came to watch and brought lunch for all of them. And it was the kind of day that a person stores in their memory not because it was remarkable, but because it was genuinely good, the ordinary and extraordinary being the same thing on such days. In the fall, when Annie was large with the child and doing more supervising than physical labor, she sat on the porch that Matthew had added to the front of the cabin in August and looked at the land in its autumn colors, the grass going gold and the elms along the creek dropping their leaves in slow, spiraling decisions. And she thought about the road that had led here, the grief and the dust and the 30 yards of careful distance, and the question she had finally asked. And the answer that had been and continued to be the truest thing she knew. Matthew came and sat beside her on the porch in the late afternoon, having come in from checking the cattle, and he smelled of horses and autumn grass in the outdoors, and he sat down and looked at the same land she was looking at. Frank said he knows a man who wants to sell 2 more horses, Matthew said. Working stock, good breeding. Buy them, Annie said. You haven't heard the price, he said. Buy them, she said again. We're building something. You don't build by being too careful. He looked at her with the full version of the smile now, the one she had earned over months of patient attention, the one she considered one of the more valuable things she had ever acquired. "Right," he said. "I generally am," she said, "though I appreciate you agreeing." He laughed the real laugh, and it moved across the porch and out into the autumn afternoon, and she held the sound of it inside herself like a thing she would never tire of. Thomas Matthew Keating was born on a Thursday in December of 1875, in the room that had been built for him, with Clara Aldrich serving as midwife with the competence of a woman who has attended enough births to be entirely unfrightened by them. Matthew was in the next room because Clara had firmly placed him there, and Annie could hear him through the wall, the almost stillness of him, the concentrated attention that a wall between them could not contain. When the baby cried, the sound changed everything in the cabin. Annie heard it before she fully heard it, felt it in her chest like a key turning in a lock, and then the baby was in her arms, small and red and furious at the cold world, and Annie felt a love so violent and immediate that it seemed impossible that she had existed before it. Matthew came in when Clara permitted him to, which was after he had been kept waiting long enough to understand the importance of the moment, and short enough to avoid genuine suffering, and he stood in the doorway of the room he had built and looked at Annie holding their son with an expression that she had never seen on him, and would carry for the rest of her life, an expression of pure, undefended wonder. He came to the bed and sat on the edge of it, and she placed the baby in his arms with the care of someone transferring something irreplaceable. And Matthew Keating, who had ridden 10 years of open country, and slept in every kind of weather and driven cattle through things that would have broken most men, held his son with a gentleness that made Annie's eyes fill in the way they now did more readily than before, grief having broken them open to let other things through as well. "Thomas," Matthew said. "Thomas Matthew," Annie said. "My father's name was Matthew," he said, looking at the baby. "I know," she said. "You told me, in November when you were asleep and talking." He looked up at her. "I talk in my sleep. Sometimes," she said. "Only important things." He looked back at the baby. "Hello, Thomas," he said, in a voice so quiet and so completely unguarded that it was almost like hearing him speak for the first time, like the voice he reserved for things he loved most. The years that followed that December were the years of building, the years of growth, the years of becoming what they had promised each other they would be. The claim grew into a proper ranch, 120 acres of deeded land with good cattle and 2 horses of excellent breeding, and a barn that Frank Aldrich called the finest structure in 3 counties, which was an exaggeration but not by as much as it should have been. Millhaven grew too, taking on a proper school and a church and a doctor's office and a dry goods store with a proprietor who stocked books, which Annie considered the most important addition. She was involved in the establishment of the school in the way that women who understand the value of education are always involved, which is to say thoroughly, bringing to the school board meetings the same combination of preparation and firmness that she had brought to the man with the red beard who had come to contest her claim. Matthew was not a man for meetings, but he was a man for building, and the schoolhouse was partially built with his hands, and he sat in the back of the meetings and said nothing and supported Annie's positions with the specific silence of a person who knows their silence is its own form of presence. Thomas grew with the energy and insistence of a child who has decided that the world is his particular project. He was dark-haired like his father, and had Annie's eyes and her stubbornness, and his father's patience underneath it, a combination that produced a child of extraordinary determination and thoughtfulness, which Annie found either promising or exhausting depending on the day. In the spring of 1878, when Thomas was 2.5 and running with a single-minded determination that kept both of his parents in a state of alert attention, Annie told Matthew that Thomas was going to have a sibling. Matthew's response was everything she had come to expect from him, which was steady and warm and practical and present, and this time he did not simply stand still. He pulled her into his arms in the doorway of the cabin and held her for a long moment in the good, solid way of his, the way that conveyed without words that she was known and valued and chosen, again and always. Their daughter was born in October of 1878, and they named her Alina after Annie's mother. And she was small and furious, and had Matthew's gray-green eyes and a disposition that made Thomas seem calm by comparison, which was remarkable. Thomas, at 3 years old, regarded Alina with the complex mixture of ownership and irritation that older siblings have always regarded new arrivals. And then, one afternoon when Alina was a few weeks old, and crying with the specific urgency of a very small person who has urgent things to say, Thomas patted her on the head with a careful hand and said, "It's okay," with the earnest solemnity of someone taking on a great responsibility. Matthew and Annie both saw it from the doorway, and neither of them spoke, because speaking would have broken something. The late 1870s brought prosperity and challenge in the proportions that honest years always provide. There was a summer of drought in 1877 that tested the cattle and the crops and the reserves they had been building against exactly this kind of test. And they came through it thinner than they had gone in, but intact, and with the cattle numbers maintained by the water from the spring that Matthew had always said was their most important resource. There were disputes with a cattle operation to the north that had ideas about grazing rights that conflicted with the facts of the boundary lines. Disputes that Annie resolved with documentation and Matthew resolved with presence, and which were eventually resolved in the way that disputes often are when one party is more prepared than the other, and the other party eventually recognizes this. There was the terrible winter of 1878 to 1879, the worst winter the plains had seen in a generation, which the newspapers called the Great Die-Up in its early stages before things improved in the spring. They lost 4 head of cattle and replaced them by the following fall. Thomas, who was 4 and old enough to understand that something serious was happening, helped his father carry feed to the animals in the snow with the unstinting seriousness of a child who is proud to be needed. And there were the good years threaded through the hard ones, the springs that came extravagant and generous, the harvests that exceeded what they had planted for, the evenings on the porch when the children were in bed and the plains were quiet, and the stars were doing their ancient work above, and Matthew would come and sit beside Annie, and they would talk or not talk in the way they had always been able to do, with or without words, the conversation never having really stopped since the morning she had asked where he was headed. In the summer of 1880, on an evening that was warm and scented with the dried grass and the creek's particular smell, Annie and Matthew sat on the porch together after supper. Thomas was 6, a serious and curious boy who was already reading with the focused intensity that made his teacher in Millhaven write letters of note home. Alina was nearly 2, walking with the confident lurch of a child who has decided she is done with the developmental stage of crawling and has no patience for caution. Both children were asleep inside. The summer night was soft around the cabin. Matthew had been quiet through supper in the particular way that Annie recognized now as the way he was quiet when he had been thinking about something and had thought about it long enough to be ready to say it. "There's a section of land for sale south of us," he said. "Borders our east line. Good drainage, good grass, would put us at close to 200 acres. "Buy it," she said. "You didn't ask the price this time either," he said. "I never do," she said. "That's not where I put my attention." "Where do you put it?" he asked. She looked at the land in the last of the evening light, the grass and the creek and the sky that had been exactly as enormous and exactly as beautiful every single night for 6 years, and showed no sign of diminishing. "Here," she said. He turned to look at her, and she was looking at him, and the word between them carried everything it had always carried, everything it had meant on the morning he said it from horseback, sitting on his bay horse with the plains behind him and the answer already prepared, and everything it had accumulated since, The cabin and the children and the crops and the cattle and the winters and the good years and the hard ones and all of it together making the single most true thing she knew. Here, he agreed. He reached over and took her hand, and they sat together in the summer dark with the creek talking below them and the stars overhead, and the land around them that they had built and were continuing to build. Not just the visible land of the ranch, but the invisible land of a life together. Every disagreement and resolution and discovery and quiet evening adding to it, making it larger and more complete. A week later, Matthew rode south and purchased the land, and Annie walked every inch of it in the August heat with a leaner on her hip and Thomas at her heels asking questions about every rock and plant and insect he encountered, which was the way Thomas engaged with the world and had been since he could talk. And Annie answered each question carefully, because she had learned from a woman named Mrs. Hargrove in Columbus, Ohio, that answering children's questions carefully is one of the most important things a person can do. The additional land changed the shape of what they were building in a way that was both practical and symbolic. It added capacity for more cattle, more crops, room enough that the ranch could sustain itself through hard years without eating its own reserves. But it also changed the feeling of the place, the sense of its possibilities, and Annie began to think about what the Here ranch might become in 20 years, in 30, in the hands of Thomas and a leaner, and whoever else came along. That thought, the thought of whoever else, made her smile in a way that she noted and then set aside for the moment. The fall of 1880 was golden and warm, one of those seasons that seem aware of their own generosity and offer themselves freely. Annie and Matthew brought in a harvest that exceeded what they had expected, and Matthew hired 2 young men from Millhaven to help with the cattle, brothers named Beck, who had the work ethic of people who know the value of what they are earning and the good sense not to complain about what they are asked to do. Thomas took to following the Beck brothers around the ranch with the intense discipleship of a 6-year-old who has discovered heroes. And Matthew watched this with the patient attention he gave everything, neither encouraging nor discouraging it, waiting to see what Thomas would take from the experience. What Thomas took from it was an education in cattle and horses, and the daily work of the ranch that no school could have provided. And Matthew began that fall to teach him deliberately, showing him things with the same patient precision that he had used to teach Annie to shoot on that second evening on the trail, correcting without diminishing and explaining without condescending. Annie watched her husband teaching her son and felt something she had no single word for, the intersection of love and gratitude and wonder at what they were making together, the visible and the invisible, the ranch and the family and the life. Reverend Alcott, who still made his circuit through the territory on his optimistic schedule, stopped at the ranch in November of 1880 and stayed for supper, and told them stories of the territory he had seen change from open range to settled country in his decade of riding it. And he ate Clara Aldrich's recipe for beef stew that Annie had learned and told Annie it was the finest meal he had eaten in 3 counties. Which was higher praise than it might seem because Reverend Alcott covered a great many counties. Before he left, he looked at the cabin and the barn and the children and the well-ordered prosperity of the place, and he said to Annie, "You have built something lasting here, Mrs. Keating." "We have," she said, which was always her correction when anyone suggested the work was hers alone, because it was not, and she would not allow anyone to think it was. In the spring of 1881, when the grasslands were coming green again and the creek was running high with snowmelt from the Rockies, Annie Crawford Keating told her husband that a leaner was going to have a sibling. He held her in the doorway again, his arms around her and his chin resting on the top of her head, and she felt the steadiness of him that had not changed in the 7 years since a morning on the Kansas plains, when he had ridden up beside a wagon at 30 yards and matched its pace without asking. "Thomas will be insufferable about it," Matthew said. "Thomas will be wonderful about it," Annie said. "He is always wonderful when it matters." "He gets that from you," Matthew said. He gets it from both of us, she said. That is how children work. Their second son, James Crawford Keating, arrived in October of 1881, a healthy and loud child who announced himself to the world with a conviction that suggested he had opinions about his arrival and intended to share them. Thomas, who was 7, regarded his new brother with the solemn, experienced air of someone who has been through this before and knows what to expect, and Eleanor, who was 3, was fascinated in the particular way of 3-year-olds, which is to say completely and with no sense of appropriate boundaries. James grew fast, the way second sons sometimes do, as though there is something about not being first that produces a competitive urgency. By his first birthday he was walking. By his second, he was following Thomas around the ranch with the same discipleship that Thomas had once shown the Beck brothers, and by his third, he had an opinion on every subject that was audible from a considerable distance. "He gets the loudness from your side," Matthew told Annie one evening. "My family is not loud," Annie said. "You once argued a man off your property by quoting legislation at him in a voice that could have called cattle," Matthew said. "That was necessary," she said. "I'm not complaining," he said. "I'm explaining where James gets it." She threw a dish towel at him, which was very low on the scale of responses available to her but was proportionate to the provocation. He caught it, which he always did, and handed it back to her with the smile that was all her own, the full one, the one that started in the gray-green eyes and reached his mouth only after a slight delay, as though it had to travel from somewhere deep inside him. The years moved with the confidence of years that are being properly used. The ranch grew to 240 acres by 1883, with a herd of 60 cattle and 4 working horses and the original 2 mules, who were aging but whose long ears and steady temperaments Annie refused to retire, because she was sentimental about them in a way she did not advertise. Frank and Clara Aldrich's own ranch expanded adjacent to theirs, and the 2 families became something that was not quite family, but was the kind of neighbor that on the open plains amounts to the same thing. Clara and Annie built a friendship over those years that was one of the most nourishing things Annie had, a friendship of honest women who respected each other's minds and called each other on nonsense in the kind way that real friends do. Thomas, at 9 and 10 and 11, became a boy of notable character, serious about his schooling and serious about the ranch and serious about his younger siblings, whom he managed with a grave competence that made the teacher in Millhaven describe him to Annie as the kind of young man who makes a teacher glad to have chosen the profession. He was also, when the gravity was not required, funny in the precise and observant way of people who pay close attention to the world, and his father's almost smile had become his own. Eleanor was ferocious and curious, and in possession of opinions that she expressed without apology, which Annie recognized with a particular combination of pride and exhausted recognition. She had her father's steadiness underneath the fierceness and her mother's stubbornness on top of it, and the teacher in Millhaven described her to Annie as the kind of young woman who makes a teacher glad to have a very sturdy constitution. James was simply himself, James, which was a full-time occupation for everyone in his vicinity. He had boundless energy and a gift for friendship that meant he was never without company of some kind, human or animal. And he had his mother's eyes and his father's hands, and an entirely original personality that seemed to belong to neither of them, but felt completely natural in the family they had made. In the winter of 1883, sitting by the fire on a Sunday evening with the children in bed and the ranch quiet outside and the plains doing their dark and enormous work around them, Matthew looked at Annie across the firelight with the expression she had learned to read as the preface to something important. "Tell me," she said. "I was thinking about the morning you asked where I was headed," he said. "Which morning?" she said, and she was being gently difficult and they both knew it. He accepted this. "The morning I told you here," he said. "I remember," she said. "It was the best answer I have ever been given to any question. I have been thinking," he said, "about all of the here since then." "All of it," She waited. "I want you to know," he said, "that it has been exactly what I meant. Every part of it. The hard parts and the easy parts and the ordinary parts and all of it together. It is exactly what I meant when I said it, and I am more certain of it now than I was then, which I did not think was possible." Annie looked at him across the fire, at the face she knew as well as she knew her own land, weathered and angular and honest, with the gray-green eyes that still had that quality she had identified on the second day on the trail and could now name, the quality of seeing clearly and making the thing seen feel known rather than exposed. "Matthew Keating," she said. "Annie Keating," he said. "You are," she said, and paused because she was choosing her words with the care that the occasion deserved. "The here at the end of every road I have ever taken, including the one I did not know I was taking." He came around the fire and sat beside her on the bench she had had since Ohio, the bench that had come west in the wagon that he had helped push out of a gully in the mud, and he put his arm around her in the way he had from the beginning, steady and warm and specific. The fire burned. Outside, the plains moved in the dark, the grass and the creek and the enormous sky doing their ancient continuous work, the work that had been going on since before any of them arrived and would go on long after, indifferent and glorious and real. But inside the cabin that they had built together, stone by limestone stone, room by room, year by year, there was a warmth that was not the fire's. There was a here that was not geography. In the spring of 1884, when the plains were putting on their finest green, and the creek was running with the particular music of good snowmelt, and the cattle were fat on the new grass, Annie and Matthew Keating rode out to the limestone shelf above the creek in the late afternoon, which had become their habit on Sunday afternoons when the children were occupied with their various industrious pursuits, and the ranch was running with its own momentum. They sat on the limestone with the view of the whole property spread below them, the cabin and the barn and the corrals and the south field and the creek and the elms and the far pasture where the cattle were small distant shapes against the grass, and the whole of it was golden in the afternoon light in the particular way that home is golden when it is genuinely yours. "What are you thinking?" Matthew asked. "I am thinking," Annie said, "that Robert would be glad." Matthew was quiet for a moment. He was that kind of man, the kind who understood that the love you have does not erase the love that came before it but lives alongside it in the honest way. "I think so too," he said. "And I am thinking," Annie said, "that I would like one more." He turned to look at her. "One more," he said. "The house is large enough now," she said. "James is old enough to not be the baby, which he will find a great relief, and I have been thinking about Margaret as a name." He looked at her for a long moment with the full weight of his attention, which was one of the finest gifts he had ever given her and continued to give her every day. "Margaret," he said. "After your mother," she said. He made a sound then that was not his almost laugh and not his real laugh, but something third, something that came from further down, and he pulled her close in the way he had from the beginning and held her in the limestone afternoon with the view of their life below them. "Margaret," he said again into her hair. "If it's a girl," she said. "And if it's not," he said. "Then we keep going until it is," she said, "unless you object." "I do not object," he said. She laughed, and it was the easy, warm laugh of a woman in the full of a life she has built and chosen, and it went out across the limestone shelf and down across the grass and into the April afternoon, and the creek caught it and carried it somewhere. Margaret Grace Keating was born in November of 1884, in the room that had been Thomas's room before the addition that had made Thomas's room into the big room and given each child a proper place. And she was small and quiet, and had a stillness in her that was entirely her father's, a settled-looking presence even in infancy, as though she had arrived with a patience that other people were still developing. Thomas, who was 10, took one look at her and became her protector on the spot with the absolute declaration of a boy who has decided something and will not be argued out of it. Eleanor, who was 6, appointed herself the primary instructor of Margaret's future education in everything from flowers to stubbornness. James, who was 3 and loud about everything, whispered at Margaret in a near silence that was the quietest he had ever been in his life, as though he understood already that she was a particular kind of person and required a particular kind of approach. Matthew held his fourth child by the fire that first evening, and Annie watched him and saw on his face everything she had learned to read there over the years, the steadiness and the wonder and the specific quality of presence that was his most defining characteristic, the ability to be entirely in the moment he was inhabiting. "Hello, Margaret," he said. "We have been waiting for you." Annie closed her eyes and listened to the fire, and the child's small breathing, and the winter wind moving past the solid walls of the cabin they had built. She thought about a spring morning in 1874, when she had been a widow of 11 days climbing up onto a wagon bench with a rifle she barely knew how to fire, and a stubbornness that had always been her greatest virtue and her most considerable flaw. She thought about the flat Kansas land unrolling ahead of her, and the enormous sky, and the rider who had appeared from the southwest at an easy lope. She thought about 30 yards of careful distance and 2 days of riding, and a morning when the question had finally been ready and the answer had already been prepared. "Where are you headed?" "Here." She opened her eyes. Here was the cabin, warm against the winter night. Here was the fire and the limestone walls and the south window that let in the afternoon light and the small east window that caught the morning. Here was Thomas and Alina and James and Margaret. Here was 10 years of building, 10 years of honest work, 10 years of a love that had begun in dust and distance and a cowboy's quiet resolve. Here was everything. Matthew looked up from the baby and found her watching him and did not look away, because he never looked away when she was watching, because he was always and entirely here, the way he had said he would be on a morning when the plains were enormous and the promise was simple and nothing about it had been false. "Tired?" he asked. "Very," she said. "Wonderfully very." "Sleep," he said. "I'll stay up with her." "You'll be useless tomorrow," she said. "I'll be useless tomorrow," he agreed easily. "Matthew," she said. "Annie," he said. "Thank you," she said, which was large enough to mean everything and small enough to be said without theater. "Thank you," he said back, which meant the same thing, which was everything, which was here. She slept, and the fire burned, and outside the Kansas winter did its work across the plains, across the grass and the frozen creek and the limestone shelf above the water where the afternoon light came gold in all seasons, and inside the cabin that Annie Crawford and Matthew Keating had built stone by stone and year by year. The here they had made together held them all in its warm and steady arms, and it was exactly what they had meant when they said it, and exactly what they had built it to be. And it was enough, and it was more than enough, and it was the truest thing that either of them had ever known.